Hey everybody, welcome back to PCS 101. And this is for our class for Wednesday, the 7th of January, where we are finishing up with most of the major chapters of the textbook, believe it or not. I wanted to talk about delivering speeches. Today is also the day that you will have your first quiz, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And also, I wanted to give you some instructions about speech number one. But first, delivering speeches. There are lots of different kinds of speeches. I was talking a little bit about them last class. There's the memorized speech, which is not what we are doing in this class. They are brief speeches, usually for highly formal events. Think of something like a toast for a wedding, for instance. There is the manuscript speech, where you are actually reading from a manuscript or a teleprompter. Now, I've never had the opportunity to read from a teleprompter, but if you look at the notes below under A for speeches, you will see a brief video, it's only a minute long or so, about a teleprompter fail. So even though you may have access to a teleprompter, that does not negate the possibility of, let's say, technological failure. Very respected director Michael Bay, as you will see in this video, was being interviewed about his latest film, obviously a topic that he was well versed in, and there was a problem with the teleprompter, and he panicked on stage and basically ran off. So the idea that you are relying completely on a teleprompter or even a manuscript puts you in a very vulnerable position. And usually you are in situations, for instance, televised events where you're reading off of a teleprompter, or perhaps you are presenting a paper in an academic conference and you are reading your manuscript. So these are the situations where it's expected that you would be reading. Certainly not in this particular class. There is the impromptu speech. This is done spur of the moment, no kind of prior preparation. These can be very dangerous kinds of speeches because you haven't had an opportunity to do any kind of preparation. Usually it happens during unexpected events. Perhaps you're being presented with an award that you weren't anticipating. My advice is to keep it short and simple. Just get in and out as quickly as you can. What we are doing is the extemporaneous speech, which is the speech that's someplace in the middle. It's prepared somewhat in advance, but it's delivered with the speaking outline of keywords and phrases. So you're filling that in with unscripted material. And in terms of presentation, because we've spent a lot of time talking about content, you want to think about your voice. You want to try to be conversational. You want to vary your volume, your speed, and your inflections. That's one of the ways that you keep your audience's attention. You want to enunciate so that you aren't mumbling, and pausing for effect. And even though this isn't necessarily fair, but life isn't always fair, most audiences will judge a speaker based on their presentation rather than their content. And perhaps this was best shown during a presidential debate in the early days of television between Nixon and Kennedy. And it was so much in the early days of television that approximately half of the audience listened to that debate on the radio, and approximately half of the audience watched it on television. And the pundits afterwards, what they found was fascinating, that the majority of individuals who listened to the debate on the radio had said that Richard Nixon had won because of the content of his arguments. But the exact opposite conclusion was reached by the majority of the audience who watched the debate on television, because President Kennedy was much more, or I should say at this point, John Kennedy, he wasn't president yet, he was much more polished, and he was handsome, he was well dressed, he understood the media. So much so that he accepted makeup before going on camera, something that Richard Nixon did not accept. And if you know anything at all about cameras and lighting, you have to wear makeup or else you just look horrible. You look very pale and ill. So there were lots of reasons ultimately why presidential debates changed at that particular moment, when the realization of the importance of this new media, television, and this is something I talk about in my media class, was going to completely change the way individuals would be experiencing messaging. So while ideally the audience is moved by your arguments. The reality is that we are most often moved by presentation. And if you think about it, when we're trying to evaluate an individual when they are giving information, we oftentimes are looking for all of those nonverbal cues. It's not just what they say, but how they say it. Now, there is something called proxemics, which is a study in and of itself, the use of space, and that too can influence how an audience receives a message, particularly in a face to face situation. The idea is that something like a seating arrangement or the idea of how close or far you are from your audience could influence how the audience responds to your message. In terms of what we're doing, obviously we're being taped, but you want to make sure that when you are being recorded, that your facial expressions and your face in general are quite visible to the audience, because this is where we read most of our nonverbal cues. In fact, it's called affect display, and these facial expressions are how we oftentimes go about gauging arguments. Very interesting study that was done years ago from psychologists to evaluate individuals who were having difficulty with social relationships. And I mean difficulties to the point where they couldn't participate in work or school. And what they found is that when they were shown pictures of facial expressions, these individuals who are having social difficulties more often than not misidentified facial expressions, which tend to be fairly universal. A smile, for the most part, means happiness. A frown, for the most part, means unhappiness. But these individuals who, again, were having difficulty interacting socially were completely misreading these facial expressions. So they would view a frown, for instance, as happiness, and a smile, for instance, as unhappiness. It makes some sense as to why they might be having some difficulty with social connections if they're completely misreading all of these subtle cues that most people take for granted. Gesturing is also very important too, and you can think about conventional gestures. This is a gesture that is assigned meaning by custom. It doesn't have to mean that. So a thumbs up, for instance, for okay. Um, a descriptive gesture can show size, shape, and location. That's a little bit more that's a little bit more universal. So I could say that it's this long and this high, for instance. But keep in mind that a conventional gesture, while it might be assigned meaning by custom by one group, it can mean something completely different by another group. So the OK sign in the United States, where you've got the thumb and the forefinger, are basically forming a circle, and then the three remaining fingers are standing up, so that's like this. In some cultures, for instance, the Brazilian culture can be viewed as an insult, FU, for instance. So you want to be very, very careful on how you're using gestures. And indicators will show feelings. So, for instance, somebody slamming a fist against a table to reinforce a point. And again, since we are being recorded, you need to think about how much of the body you want to show and how much gesturing is visible in there. A lot of times people tend to fidget. Now, if you're fidgeting and it's off camera, that's fine. But if you're fidgeting and it's on camera, then obviously you want to try to reduce that fidgeting, or you want to try to reduce anything that's going to distract your audience. So if you're too stiff, or if you're pacing, for instance, if you're saying these filler words, one or two are fine. But if you're doing this after every sentence, more often than not, individuals are doing that so that they can get a breath. But if your audience is beginning to think, wow, that person's very stiff, or they've said a lot of then ultimately they're not focusing on the content of your message, they're focusing on the delivery of the message. So you want to try to avoid that. Eye contact. For our culture, Western culture, eye contact is viewed as a sign of engagement, and you should try to vary your eye contact across audiences. Of course, again, being recorded, our eye contact is towards the screen. And again, you want to look into the camera so that basically the camera is your audience, in effect. And In terms of eye contact, that also can be culturally based. There are some cultures, for instance, Spanish cultures, where eye contact is considered to be a sign of offense, that you're being rude. So you need to be very careful in terms of understanding how your audience is going to be interpreting not just your message, but the presentation of your message. So all of this is related to our getting ready for speeches. And if you'll remember, in the syllabus and other documents folder, I have a speech rating sheet that I will be using for speech number 1. It's a template that basically reviews all of the major elements that we've discussed thus far. And it's ranked on a series from none to needs improvement to good to excellent. It's divided up into 2 elements, the first being content, the second being delivery. In terms of the content, thinking about the introduction. Do you have a way to get your audience's attention? Which could be just as simple as greeting your audience to let them know that it's time to begin. Do you have a transition so that you can get into the content of your speech itself? And then your body or your discussion section, as talked about in the Toastmasters video. Is there a clear pattern? Are your main points stated? Are you developing those points sufficiently? What are your voice mannerisms? Again, the ums, the ahs. Do you have any filler words? And do you have well-chosen words? And again, we talked about that you're not going to have the level of exactness that you would have when you're writing, but still you want to be specific enough so the audience understands what it is that you're discussing. And a conclusion. Are you summarizing and restating? And do you have some sort of a concluding statement just to let your audience know that you've come to an end? And it could be just as simply as thanking your audience. But again, we want a cue that you are beginning your speech and a cue that you are ending your speech. In terms of delivery, things like eye contact, body movement, vocal quality, articulation, enthusiasm. So even if you don't necessarily feel terribly enthusiastic, part of this is acting. Because if you're not enthusiastic when you're delivering, then why should we be enthusiastic about listening? So all of these elements play a role. And in terms of thinking about speech number 1, you will also be utilizing all of these elements in speech number 2 and in speech number 3. But speech number 1 is deliberately supposed to give you practice with delivering a speech. This autobiographical 5-minute speech that I'm going to ask you to upload on Thursday, the 8th, before midnight. So you will be uploading your speech, and you can see this in the notes below in the second section, to Moodle. What I'm going to be doing tomorrow is adding a folder so that you can, or actually what I'm going to be doing soon, I'm actually filming this on Tuesday, but what I'm going to be doing on Wednesday is adding a folder to Moodle. It'll be in the general section at the top for speech number 1, and that's where you can upload speech number 1. And I'm asking you to send a copy of your speaking outline to my email, which happens to be Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And of course, I want to see the outline that you're using, not the outline that you think I want to see. And I need to have the outline before I evaluate your speech. And I've got below some instructions from IT about the best way to go about recording and uploading your speech. That basically they recommend using YouTube, which is what I do for these classes actually, and logging on to studioyoutube.com, clicking the blue button on the dashboard, dropping and dragging the MP4 file, or click the Select Files button to open a file picker window. On the Details window, add a description as the video is being uploaded. When you click Next, you'll be prompted to identify if the video is intended for children. Most users skip the Adding Elements button. On the Visibilities tab, set the visibility, and then click Save. You want to make sure that it's set so that your classmates can view this video, because after you have uploaded your video in our next class, which is why it's important that you keep to deadlines, the assignment is going to be for students to review that video and to send me strengths and weaknesses. But don't do that until we've talked about it in class. So Some speech points to remember. Remember to greet your audience to let us know that you're beginning your speech. Remember to use a speaking outline and not a script. You're not reading. Be conversational. Look into the center of the camera. The camera is basically your audience. Make sure your lighting and your audio is sufficient. You keep to the time frame indicated, which is approximately 5 minutes, give or take a little bit on either end, but you want to get as close to 5 minutes as you can. Obviously, the longer the speech, the more latitude you have to either be under or over time. Use transitions to connect your points. Don't splice together multiple recordings. This should all be done in one take, and it does not need to be perfect. I record my classes in one take, and I'm well aware that it isn't perfect, but it's good enough. It would be much like what you would be experiencing in a real-time face-to-face situation. So that's what you're trying to duplicate as well. Conclude smoothly and clue us in that you've come to a conclusion. If you're using audio or visuals, make sure they enhance rather than detract. You're not required to use audio visuals for the first speech. You will be for the second speech. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And of course, send a copy of your speaking outline to my email again, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And double check to make sure your video is playable on Moodle for class viewing. So remember, the whole point of you uploading this video is so that I and your classmates can ultimately view this video. So what's left is for you to take quiz number 1, which will be your attendance form response. So you don't need to do a separate attendance form response. And I ask that you return the quiz via PDF to my email. That's how my grading program works best. I suggest copying and pasting the quiz, which is in the notes below, into a word processing document. And this is in lieu, again, of your discussion forum response. So you can see there are 20 questions here. And you've got 48 hours in which to submit in this quiz, but the sooner the better, obviously. So that said, I hope you are doing well. I'm doing well. And when we continue on, you will see that on Thursday you will have a place for uploading speech number 1. Take care. Bye-bye.